Happy Sexy First Friday. Second Sexy First Friday. I realize that this is actually the second Friday of the month. I can't believe we are already in April. I am just waiting for Sam to join me. And then today we're going to be talking all about Enneagram basics. Sam has joined, so let me just accept her and hopefully we have with the technology because sometimes we do. And hopefully it lets me let her in without issue. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Lyndsey, happy April.
Happy April to you as well. I was thinking it actually was the first Friday, and I'm like, no, it's actually the second.
That's true. We're like halfway through April already,
We
almost.
are. I know it's going so quickly. Well, we'll just give our standard introductions. Many of you already do know us, but some of you do not. And so we'll just talk a little bit about who Sam and I are. And then we're going to go into our basic Enneagram series today, starting with the history of the Enneagram. So my name is Lyndsey Frazier. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as a certified sex therapist and IA accredited professional who has a practice in South Minneapolis where I specialize in relationships in sexuality. And I often forget to say what my Enneagram type is, but I am an Enneagram 9 who leads with social. How about you, Sam? Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Sam E. Greenberg. I'm a doctor of psychology and a sexuality researcher and Enneagram coach specializing in sexuality, intimacy, and relationships. And I am a type 5 sexual subtype.
Well, welcome everybody. As you know, the last, I guess this would be episode 7 where we have kind of gone into basic series. So a couple months ago, we started with our sexuality basic series. So if you missed that, feel free to go back and watch that. And then last time we did our relationships basic series, which we just ended with. And then now we wanted to go into Enneagram basics. Most of you know us for Enneagram and sexuality people, but we also realize that some people that follow us are not as familiar with the Enneagram. And we thought it was a really great way to just kind of bring in the basics around the Enneagram. And today we're going to start a little bit with the history. And Sam's going to be doing a lot of talking because she's great at these history aspects of things. And we're just going to talk a little bit about like, where did it come from? Where do we, what is the history of it, which is convoluted in some ways, but there's also lots of great information out there. So why don't you start a little bit, Sam, talking about the history and the origins of the Enneagram?
Sure. One of the things that I just thought of when you were introducing is one of the funny things that's happened a few times to us is that people will get involved with our work who aren't familiar with the Enneagram, and they'll actually say to us, "Oh, is the Enneagram just a sexuality thing, or is there any use for it outside of sexuality?" And it's so funny, of course, because there's millions of uses for the Enneagram, and we happen to be the sexuality people. So this is kind of for our folks who have found us more via the sexuality side to introduce them to some basics. And of course, there's lots of great trainings and resources available out there that do basics as well. So let's talk history and origins of the Enneagram. I would love for people to put on their university, college selves right now, because this is going to be a bit of a lecture from me, just for the first part here, because there's a lot of information. And then Lyndsey and I will like chat about some of the things that come up. So with the history and origins of the Enneagram, it's important to know that there's going to be two perspectives on this. There's going to be our scientific perspective, and then there's going to be our mystical perspective. So, a variety of theories exist about the supposed ancient origins of the Enneagram symbol, sacred geometry, mathematics that may lie hidden within it. I'll share some of these theories, but keep in mind you can interpret them through a lens of standard materialist science, which would lead you to one conclusion, or you could interpret them through a mystic spiritual lens, which may lead you to a different conclusion. So bring, I guess, your open mind in that way. So starting with the ancient history. So what I'm going to say is there's several theories, but there's sort of like 2 to 3 main theories about the supposed ancient origins of the Enneagram and the Enneagram symbol. So one of them is this idea of the desert fathers, which would be like the sort of like the Christian mystics. And it's in an article called Hidden in Plain Sight Observations on the Origins of the Enneagram that Wiltz and Palmer talk about this one a lot. They talk about the origins of the Enneagram dating back to the 4th century to a monk called, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, but Evagrius of Pontus, I think is how you say it. So it was a monk, a Christian, spiritually advanced scholar who had discussed sacred geometry, and he focused on the shapes of triangle and hexagon. So maybe an early understanding of the Enneagram symbol. But further and maybe more relevant, Evagrius of Pontus wrote about 8 vices or obstructions to prayer, and he called these the logos moi. And Wilson Palmer are arguing that these are the same as 8 of the 9 Enneagram types, and that, a 9th one was added later. So they think, that's where the origins are of it, and that these teachings from Evagrius influence the beliefs of then the Persian Sufis, a group that's commonly credited for developing the origins of the Enneagram. You might hear sometimes that it's a Sufi mystical origin. So that of 2 has been disputed, but that is their one sort of family of theories. A second family of theories is even more ancient, which would be the Sumerian civilization or sort of Mesopotamia. So some Enneagram scholars have said that the Enneagram has connection to several centuries BC, and that it was preserved through oral tradition rather than written down. And then, according to this theory, there is a brotherhood of wise men in Mesopotamia who preserved the mystic teachings associated with the diagram from about maybe 2000 BC until the 6th century BC, when they then would be taught to Pythagoras. So sometimes people talk about Pythagoras being involved. Then the keepers of the Enneagram traditions maybe migrated towards present-day Uzbekistan and maybe transmitted the diagram then to the Sufis. It's a little bit convoluted, this one, but this one is that is more ancient. It goes into several centuries BC. Then there's another theory about Plotinus's Enneads, which is a philosophic work from the 2nd century BCE, described 9 mystical states. So maybe that's, relevant. Enneads, 9 states. Additional theories credits, ancient Orthodox Christianity, Sufi literature directly, esoteric Judaism via philosopher Philo, whose contributions later appeared in Kabbalah. Some Enneagram scholars say there are no ancient roots at all, or that it's not handed down from a particular spiritual tradition, but rather an amalgam of various bodies of knowledge, but largely a modern invention. So I'm going to stop there. That's a bunch of stuff about the ancient roots. So a scientific perspective, and I am a scientist, a social scientist, is actually limited evidence exists to support any of this. Any claim of a connection between the modern Enneagram and antiquity is really not supported by credible scientific evidence. So that would be the scientific perspective. A more mystical perspective might be, what is evidence anyway? Myth is its own kind of truth, and there's a lot of this kind of mythology surrounding the Enneagram being ancient. And if you ask just someone on the street who's heard of the Enneagram, oh, do you know where the origins are? Often they're like, I think it has ancient roots, So there's definitely this mythology around it. And spiritual traditions that billions of people follow also don't have concrete scientific evidence to support them. So we don't necessarily need concrete scientific evidence for something to be true or to be at least valuable for people. So the Enneagram symbol does touch on some of these aspects that resonate across spiritual traditions, often it's talked about the law of 1, the law of 3, and the law of 7 kind of being inherent there in the Enneagram symbol, and how those numbers are connected across spiritual traditions. So maybe believing in the Enneagram's ancient origins is a matter of faith. I'm going to pause there and see if you have anything to add, Lyndsey, or any questions, thoughts.
No, I think it's with anything, right? When there's mystical roots or it's something that's been passed on oral tradition, right? We're not necessarily going to be able to pinpoint exactly when it came into the world. And I think that's one of the very interesting things sort of with the Enneagram is we do sort of have this scientific perspective as well as this mystical perspective. And actually it did come into psychology too, which I think maybe you'll touch on a little bit. But I feel like in the 80s, it became something that therapists and psychologists, like it had kind of like a boom and then went away for a while and then is coming back as well.
Yes, I will do modern history as well. Okay, well, that's a good transition. So, second part of the lecture, I'll try to make it a little bit brief so we can chat more. So, the Enneagram's modern history can be traced to the early 20th century. Um, so even so, the modern history is also a source of debate and controversy in the Enneagram community. There's some things that haven't been resolved, basically. But the earliest written records on the modern Enneagram date from the early 20th century and refer to the work of George Gurdjieff, who taught the Enneagram symbol in Russia as early as 1915. He was a mystic, spiritual teacher, a bunch of other things, traveled the world studying spiritual traditions. He himself claimed to have contact with secret spiritual societies, including a society known as the Sarmong Brotherhood, which he indicated was the source of Enneagram knowledge. So that could be one of the ways that these ancient origin stories began, is that Gurdjieff suggested this kind of link to secret societies, secret spiritual societies. So Gurdjieff did describe the three centers of intelligence that we see in the Enneagram, head, heart, and gut or instinct. And he suggested a person's going to be dominant in one center, that we all have an essence, a true self, and then a personality that results from outside influence and that we can get back to our essence. He taught at length on the Enneagram symbol, basically as it is today. And he considered that symbol to be a representation of process. Sometimes people talk about the process Enneagram, that each point on the Enneagram has part of a process, but he didn't explicitly talk about 9 personality types. That came later with Oscar Chazo in the much later 20th century, like towards the 70s and 80s, what you're talking about, Lyndsey. Chazo is the first person to talk about the 9 personality orientations, specifically, like the 9 types. And he had a psychospiritual model of human development he called proto-analysis. Some Enneagram people credit Chazo fully for the development of the Enneagram. Others kind of credit Gurdjieff more. But Achazo acknowledged he had some influences, including, you might remember this from earlier, Plotinus's Enneads and Pythagoras. But he denied there's any Sufi origin, and he claimed full proprietary ownership over the whole personality system, like that it was his, that he made up. This is where the story gets a little thorny, if you like a little drama, because in the early 1990s, Achazo took full credit for the Enneagram, said Gurdjieff deserved no credit at all, and he sued author and Enneagram teacher Helen Palmer. You may have heard about this if you're an Enneagram person, for copyright infringement because of her books that she'd written on the Enneagram, based on the premise that her published works on the Enneagram stole his work. And then a US Court of Appeals actually ruled in her favor. So they recognized him as the rightful author, but that he had said it wasn't a hypothesis. It was just like sort of factual. He was saying the Enneagram is truth. And then the US Court of Appeals ruled, well, you can't copyright truth, basically. And I know I'm going a lot into detail, but this is the reason that everyone, including Lyndsey and myself, are able to use the Enneagram today under fair use doctrine. That we don't have to like constantly pay royalties or something, or constantly give credit for the Enneagram as a whole. There was this sort of landmark court case that happened in the 90s. Okay, I'm almost done talking. So then, a student of Achazo's, Claudio Naranjo, he was the one who expanded the definitions of each Enneagram type a lot. He used the technique of interviewing students, focusing on overlap with psychiatric and psychological patterns, and created greater, bigger descriptions of the character structure of each type. Sort of significantly expanded it. And then many well-known Enneagram authors that you probably have heard of, like Helen Palmer and Rizzo and Hudson, were students of Naranjo, and then they're the ones who are kind of responsible for disseminating the Enneagram into popular culture. So whether it was influenced by ancient spiritual traditions or not, we don't know. Sacred numerology or not, we don't know. But we know it gained widespread popularity around the 90s. And then, like you said, Lyndsey, it's kind of gone up and had peaks and then gone off and had valleys again since then. But that is sort of the ancient and modern history in a nutshell. Thanks for attending this lecture.
That was your quick overview. There's lots more than that.
So there's some kind of debates that we could have or talk about, and one of them is that science versus mystical perspective. We went into that a little bit, but we also want to talk about what the origins of type itself might be, considering kind of like the history of your own type in your own self. Lyndsey, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, in the Enneagram world, you get sort of two perspectives of like when Enneagram type forms, right? Either it's something you're born with, or it's more like personality theory, where we know personality is developed within the first 5 years. And so it's a really interesting debate that I think happens quite frequently within the Enneagram community. And we thought we would just talk a little bit about sort of like our perspective or our view on that. And so like where I lie is that it is more of something that develops within the first 5 years, but that we might be predisposed. And I think Sam and I are actually in a pretty similar position on this, but I wanted to get some of your ideas around that perspective as well, Sam.
One of the things that I think is funny is that some of the folks in the narrative Enneagram tradition in the US that I had studied under talked about how they were all very sure that that type developed in the first 5 years, that it was basically entirely nurture until they all started having children. And when they realized that their children were born like at infancy with some traits, notable character traits, they started to lean towards more of a mixed perspective. I tend to have a mixed perspective. I don't believe, as some people do, that an infant is born and literally has its type when it comes into the world. I don't personally subscribe to that, but I do think there's some predispositions happening when we're born. Like I think, for example, myself, there was no chance I would end up an assertive Enneagram type. So I don't know that I was born a 5, but I definitely was probably born with one of the more withdrawn, sort of half of the spectrum as the most likely outcome. So I think we're born with those tendencies, and then I do think there's a really, really strong nurture component, and then that nurture component is stronger. But a lot of people don't believe that. So
Yeah, it's interesting when you kind of think of that perspective too, because like I know that, for instance, I have always been a more sensitive physiological child, right? Like I've always been a little bit more sensitive. And so like to me, it's like, yes, I was going to be more paying attention to the environment, and then within that environment, you came to sort of that Enneagram 9 type, right? But when you think of that, like I have a sibling, right, who is a sister who is a 7 and a very assertive type, right? So there's just this ability of like, you can be in the same environment and have two different Enneagram types. And yes, of course, birth order plays a piece in that as well. But I do think that even if you just saw my sister and I as children, little small kids, we were very different from the beginning. And that probably helped frame a little bit of where we would find the type to help us have that survival mechanism sort of within the world. It is interesting when I hear it too, because some people think that like if you have parents that are a certain type, then you must be, these types of Enneagram types. I don't adhere to that theory either. Like I don't think that, so some of the theories or ideas is like if I'm a 9, then my children must be also 3 and 6. And that definitely, I would say, is not particularly the case, and so I think that, this is where you get a wide variety of ideas and really honing in on like what feels true to you and what fits for you. But I think there's a little bit more chaos in the world as far as how we develop sort of our Enneagram types as well.
I had a couple of thoughts. I think I only remember one of them. I think, it would be great to see some science done on this. It would be great to have some mapping done on, people's parents, but to do that well, to do that methodologically well, you would have to confirm the types of people's parents and confirm their type. So it would be very difficult to do that study, but it would be interesting to map that and actually see if there are some patterns, because you're right, people talk about it, but it doesn't seem in our experience working with people to be playing out where there's like particular parent types that have particular child types. And then another thing I want to say about nature versus nurture is with infants under 3 months old, you can see, as early as days after birth, but definitely before 3 months, you can see a strong preference for if they're to be being carried, for facing either inwards towards like the mother or the parent or whoever's carrying them, or facing outwards towards the world. And this is something I didn't know until I became a parent myself, but it's very well known by parents, is that, your little infant might like fuss a lot if they're facing inward and they love facing out, or they might fuss a lot if they're facing out and they love facing in. And we see that like the more sensitive nervous system babies like to face in, and the more like stimulus seeking babies like to face out. And I don't believe that the parents could be doing anything to create that early. Like that's the sort of stuff that I think is that we're born with, like you said too, Lyndsey. So then our parents come in and give us the hurtful messaging, or they do everything right, but somehow we still get hurt anyway in the 9 different ways, and then the type is being created. This brings up another question I have for you, Lyndsey, which is how early in like a child's life do you think type starts to become a little bit apparent? We know we don't want to type and pigeonhole children, but how soon do you think you can sort of start to see it?
I think that, well, it's like personality, right? I think by the time a child is hit 5 or 6 years old, you're going to start to see some tendencies, though I think it's still really important to not type your child during that phase, right? Because there's also developmental stages that we go through and how we need to interact and relate within the world that can mimic Enneagram types, right? But is developmentally what you're supposed to be doing, right? Like assertive twos, for instance. The role of a 2-year-old, right, is to assert and ask for what they need or what they want. And, just because a 2-year-old's doing that doesn't mean they're an assertive type, right? It might just be the developmental phase that they're in. But I think you do start to see sort of tendencies. Like even when you were sharing, like I'm like, oh, I was definitely the facing in child. I was definitely the child that like wanted to like hold my mom's hand or hold my mom's leg or be very close to her at all times. And my sister, is like the opposite. So she's a little like, she's always like, I don't know, like look at me a lot more than I was, and like loved it, like just like a little bit more of like the showman and things like that. Even just thinking of us as children, and much more like spunky and assertive than I ever was. And and we're like 4.5 years apart. So like I also got to observe sort of how different she was even as a small child compared to myself. But like even my own 2 children, I have one child that I would say would be more of an inward facing one, and I have one that's more outward facing and was climbing up the cat tree at a 1.5 years, and the other one was never left his crib. So so it's just like there are some tendencies there. So I think you can start to kind of get an idea, right? Like are they going to be more withdrawal? They're going to be more assertive. But I think just allowing children to sort of be in, because whether we like it or not, in my perspective, like they need to experience some of that wounding as well, right? To come into their own development and to be who they are. And no matter what we do, we can be good enough parents, and our children are still going to develop these stories about us. I could go into a whole other thing about that, about like how you, as a parent, how you can like receive the feedback your children have, but that's like a completely different episode and a completely different issue. But like most of us are doing the best that we can as parents, and we still are going to create pain experiences for our children. And a lot of that is based on the stories we create for ourselves as well.
So if you imagine, with our guilt as parents, we don't want to do any wounding, obviously. But if you imagine that you didn't create any wounding and you did everything perfect, you were just enlightened, your child wouldn't have a type, and I essentially don't think there are any humans that don't have a type. There may be some monks that have, are just in constant state of meditation and they don't have a type anymore. But otherwise, we grow towards integration where we're essentially all nine and we're not showing our type as much, but every human has a type. So before parents are beating themselves up on creating the type of their child with their wounding, like we all do it. It's unpredictable which way it will go. So yes, as a general matter, of course, we don't want to type children. We always just kind of hold that lightly. If we're starting to see type tendencies, we hold it lightly. We don't, tell them about it or anything like that. So we covered the actual history of the Enneagram, ancient and modern. And then we also covered kind of our own personal history in terms of when do we develop our own type. And we are already at the end.
We are. And one of the feedback that I give my parents in therapy, and I tell myself, is we need to mess our kids up just enough so they're normal. Otherwise, we'd have these weird little beings walking around, and that like we're all, and it's part about the humanness of being human, right? Like everybody, it's kind of like that story of like we all create shame experiences, but like if it's a sentence or two in your book versus a full chapter, we're doing great. So just remind yourself that if you're a parent as well. But yes, it went so quickly, as these always do, and we could go into so much more information. We are going to be continuing sort of in the next, we actually have a guest coming in next. Do we say who it is, or do we surprise them later on, Sam?
Let's make it a surprise because
Okay.
our guest is helping us determine the next Enneagram Basics topic. So it'll be a surprise topic and a surprise guest for May.
And sounds great. So we will have 2 more episodes in Enneagram Basics. So make sure you join us next Friday for the first Friday of the month to go into the second. And we have kind of like 2 offerings as well that we can kind of touch on. So we have our renewed and new Enneagram for Transform Relationships course, Enneagram and Sexuality for Transform Relationships. Sorry, I did not say that correctly. This also has CEUs if you are a therapist and you need those, so don't hesitate to reach out. It is for CEUs, and I believe we had, was it 1 cultural or 2 cultural? I can't remember. There's some cultural CEUs included as well. I think it's 2. So that so if you need those CEUs and you want to learn more about the Enneagram and sexuality, feel free to do that. And we are going to be doing a Repressed Instincts workshop in the fall. So we hope to see you for that as well.
We always have, our basic Enneagram and type training as well as our Enneagram and instincts training. If you're looking for something shorter and kind of more digestible, we have those too on our websites. But we're really excited about the new streamlined version of our Enneagram and Sexuality for Transform Relationships and about our Repressed Instinct training coming up. You can always find those links in Instagram bios and at our websites. And I will see you next month, Lyndsey.
That sounds good. See you next month. Take care, Sam.
Bye.
Bye.